Hello, I'm Isabel Aimee and I'm going to read you another inspiration story. This time it's Clessidra Turnabout. That's her. Clessidra Turnabout and the Upside Downers, except they look quite right way round there. Oh, this is what they look like at the beginning of the story. Upside down. See, the feet are on the top and the head's there. So this is the story I'm going to read to you today. Are you ready? Let's see. It's an upside down book, by the way. I wonder why. We'll find out. Clessidra Turnabout lived in an ancient but comfortable house full of colour and life. It was cosy, filled with soft fabrics and decorated with plants, flowers and birds. Clessidra was one of those people who loved to sing and dance in her spare time. You could catch her if you managed to peek through her kitchen window, twirling about and singing to herself just for fun. In fact, just about everything she did was for the fun of it. Mr. and Mrs. Upside Down lived in a sharp, grey and white house, neat as a pin, immaculately clean and showing not a trace of use. They liked plastic, concrete and metal furniture with sharp corners. Shall we see? There's a picture. Oh, yes. See, you've seen that, but here's a bigger one. Look at that. It's a bit of a grey world, isn't it? Grey, black, white. He looks so uncomfortable the way he's sitting on the chair. Let's find out more. Fun was not a thing which Mr. and Mrs. Upside Down understood in any way. They didn't understand fun when they cleaned their house with an array of very strong chemicals. They didn't understand fun when they sat in front of their television to watch the evening news. And they didn't understand fun when they went for a walk in the garden to pull out every weed from between the stones of the patio. To Mr. and Mrs. Upside Down, life was all about work. Their thoughts were consumed by what other people thought about them. They even thought about what the neighbours were thinking about what they were thinking. You can imagine it was quite a difficult existence. Their whole lives were devoted to somehow getting things right. In fact, doing things right was so important to Mr. and Mrs. Upside Down that it had caused them to forget fun and miss out on joy. Oh, look, here's a picture of them cleaning. Do you see how upside down they are? Poor little things. And look at all those spray bottles. XXX. That looks pretty poisonous. They don't look very happy, do they? Well, who would be standing in your head like that all day? Clessidra Turnabout lived not so very far from Mr. and Mrs. Upside Down. If you imagine a street where there were very neat houses in a row, and then at the end of the row in a space where the countryside began, well, that was where Clessidra Turnabout lived. Her house was a spot of colour and homemade craftsmanship at the edge of the village, nestled into the countryside. Clessidra's love for animals and trees, flowers and sky meant that her house was often full of these things. Outside, in her garden, in winter, she loved throwing seeds to the birds. In the autumn, she would just spend time collecting wild plants and berries from the surrounding hedgerows. In the summer, she'd find interesting shells on the beach and little crystalline stones in the streams and make little paths in her garden or pictures for her friends. She'd often be seen wandering about the lanes and the footpaths, staring excitedly at the dewdrop-laden spiderwebs which hung from the branches of the hedgerows in autumn, or collecting berries into a basket for a pie she'd be baking later on that day. You could even catch Clessidra Turnabout chatting to a cow, or a sheep, or a cat, or a dog she might come across as she journeyed through the woods and fields. Here she is, look. Here's Clessidra. Ta-da! She does look happy. What a happy person. Funny shaped body too, but characters in books are quite curious sometimes. Clessidra and Mr. and Mrs. Upside Down rarely met. They never ran in the same circles. They just didn't have the same kind of interests. Where Clessidra would order unrefined cocoa from Brazil, Mr. and Mrs. Upsidedown bought super sweet hot chocolate in cafes. Where Mr. and Mrs. Upsidedown would go on long shopping trips in their car, Clessidra Turnabout would stroll through the fields to the nearest town, potter about, chatting to random strangers, and then head home. Mr. and Mrs. Upsidedown didn't talk to strangers. Strangers were strange and not to be spoken to. In fact, Mr. and Mrs. Upsidedown were positively scared of strangers. The only strangers they liked, and indeed invited into their homes, were the characters which spoke to them through the television in their sitting room. These strangers could talk as much as they liked, even if they were scary. Oh, look, here's a picture of them. Look at that, did you see? There's a rose bush growing somewhere, maybe in the corner of their garden. Very neat garden, look. But here she's got a rose in a plastic cone. No wonder she doesn't look very happy. Oh, Mr. and Mrs. Upsidedown. One day, Mr. and Mrs. Upsidedown were feeling a little unwell. Are you surprised? And so they took themselves off to the doctor. The doctor looked at them, asked them some questions, and then wrote out a prescription for them to collect from the chemist. Mr. and Mrs. Upsidedown purchased their medicine, drove home, and got busy getting well. First, they took the correct dosage, and then they took themselves to bed for some sleep. They never noticed the party going on at the end of the neat row of houses. That week, Clessidra Turnabout had been feeling particularly frisky and fun-filled and had decided to host a party for her friends. First, she made mango ice cream in preparation for their party supper. Next, she baked and iced a carrot cake. Then she made a fish pie, a vegetarian quiche, a huge bowl of salad, and some exotic fruity drinks. That sounds nice. Once everything was ready and the table was dancing with leaves, flowers, candles and shiny crystal glasses, her guests began to arrive. Clessidra Turnabout took off her flowery apron, fluffed up her hair. Should I just do that? Should I just fluff up my hair? It does feel good to fluff up your hair. See? Fluffed up her hair and opened the door to her friends who came in out of the cold. As soon as they entered the house, the wave of colour and fun lit up her guests, who began to giggle and laugh. They told stories, they sang songs, they ate and they danced, they kissed and they hugged, and when the time came for them to go home, they gathered their coats, hats and shoes and made plans for another party in the future. No one thought about Mr. and Mrs. Upsidedown. No one at the party knew that Mr. and Mrs. Upsidedown were tucked up in bed, dosed up with medicine and snoring loudly. While the noise and music of the party was in full swing, Mr. and Mrs. Upsidedown were deeply asleep, their dreams quiet and cool and grey. When they woke in the morning, Mr. and Mrs. Upsidedown felt a lot better, and so they both went back to work. Oh, look. This must be all the medicine they've been taking. Looks like a bottle of special medicine and pills. And there's a spoon. No wonder they slept so long and so well. Look, this must be Clessidra Turnabout at home with the cake. That definitely looks like party mode, doesn't it? Can you see that? Look at that. What a cake. But some people have already been enjoying it. That must have been some of her guests. Let's find out what happens next. Clessidra Turnabout was out in her front garden that next morning, and she noticed her neighbours getting into their car in their cool black suits and driving off. They didn't see her wave, and they didn't notice the bright flowers tumbling over the edges of her garden wall. Mr. and Mrs. Upsidedown left for their office, where the walls and floor were grey and white, and their work colleagues were dressed in sharp suits and ate neatly packaged snacks and low-fat foods for lunch. By the time Mr. and Mrs. Upsidedown had come home from a day at the office, Clessidra had picked flowers for her table, planted bulbs for the spring, fed the birds, mended her jumper and darned her socks, baked a pie, cleaned and scrubbed the kitchen, written a card, and had sat down to draw a picture for her latest children's story. Story writing was one of the things Clessidra Turnabout liked to do with her time. She would open the floodgates of her imagination and allow people and stories to take form and enter our world and inhabit the page. Look, this must be a picture of her creating stories. Look at that, full swing, all the swirls of the imagination and creative juice flowing about her mind, and her heart looks really big and expanded. There's her book. Oh, it looks like she's singing or speaking, or quite explosive and colourful. You can see how very differently our three characters lived. And you may be wondering why I have told you so much about these very different people. Some people might say that Mr. and Mrs. Upside Down needed more colour in their lives, and Clessidra Turnabout needed less, but I would say that whatever Clessidra had would blow Mr. and Mrs. Upside Down's minds if they received too strong a dose. Almost like getting too much medicine, it feels like. But maybe it would do something different. But this story is about how one tiny drop of Clessidra's essence arrived on the doorstep of Mr. and Mrs. Upside Down and completely changed their lives forever. This was how it happened. Clessidra Turnabout had ordered new paints for her illustrating work. She had searched for the most luscious, luminescent paints and had ordered them specially to be delivered to her doorstep by the postman. Every day, as she went out to the garden to check on the plants and the bird food and water, she would look out for the postman. On the day the parcel was actually delivered, Clessidra was so involved in her after-breakfast drawing that she forgot to go out and check for the postman. The postman was new on his rounds and had accidentally delivered her parcel to her neighbour's house. He delivered it 3 houses down the street to Mr. and Mrs. Upside Down's front door. When Mr. and Mrs. Upside Down returned from a long day at their black and white office, they found a parcel left on their porch. As it was dark outside, they didn't want to go hunting for its proper owner, who might be a stranger after all. They put the parcel carefully on the hall shelf and told each other that they would deliver it the next day, Saturday, when there was no work to go to. The next day came, and Mr. and Mrs. Upside Down made sure to eat all of their favourite foods for breakfast that day. They started off with white toast and bacon and fried eggs and black pudding, tomatoes, mushrooms, a pot of coffee, and 2 heaped spoons of sugar for each of their mugs. Once this had all been consumed, Mr. and Mrs. Upside Down felt much stronger and able to go out into the wide world of the village and identify which neighbour the parcel belonged to. Clessidra was out in her garden that morning, pruning the shrubs for their spring growth. There was always lots to do in the garden to make room for the new shoots, as plants love to grow. As she worked, she hummed a little tune and chatted with the robin who liked to accompany her on her garden rounds. Mr. and Mrs. Upside Down approached the front gate, knowing they would have to disturb this strange lady. Coughed Mr. Upside Down politely, attempting to get Clessidra's attention. Excuse me? Mr. Upside Down quietly tried again, although Clessidra's back was turned as she chatted to the robin in her whistling tones. That's how you talk to a robin. Mr. Upside Down tried one more time, with a little louder, while his wife trembled with anxiety. Excuse me, madam? Clessidra turned about, beamed out a huge smile and said a large hello to her neighbours who were clutching her parcel. She wiped her hands on her apron, extended her hand to shake Mr. and Mrs. Upside Down's, and invited them inside for a cup of tea. Oh, look, here's Mr. Upside Down clutching the parcel. That must be Clessidra in the background with her garden. Goodness. He looks like he's blushing a little. Maybe he was. Before they knew what had happened, Mr. and Mrs. Upsidedown were seated in Clessidra's kitchen. The kettle was boiling and Clessidra busied herself arranging cookies on a plate. Oh, probably rather like these ones. And perhaps the cup of tea was rather like this one. Maybe I should have a sip. Ooh. I'm sure it was very much like that cup of tea. Oh, and she pulled the tea cosy from out of one of her dresser drawers while Mr. and Mrs. Upsidedown looked about them, as if in a daze. All they could see was colour. The shelves of the dresser showed pastel blue and green and yellow and pink cups and saucers. The walls were covered in Clessidra's illustrations, in bright golden frames. The chairs were cushioned with warm fabrics, the windows framed in soft curtains, the room dotted with lamps emitting soft, warm light. Every surface they looked at was handmade, slightly irregular and made of natural materials. Mr. and Mrs. Upsidedown found themselves breathing rather differently than before. They hardly dared move or catch each other's eye for fear they would begin impolitely laughing from the shock of it all. Must have been a shock to them, I suppose. This looks like them in their house, in her house. Look at all the colour. Hoo, 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 hoo. What a shock to Mr. and Mrs. Upsidedown, black, grey and white, hey? Hoo. Looks like they're blushing again. What's going to happen next? There we are, proclaimed Clessidra, setting down a tray of tea things. Oh, probably rather like this one. There we are, proclaimed Clessidra, and proceeded to ask Mr. and Mrs. Upsidedown which coffee cups they would like to drink of. Having never been asked which colour cups they would like before, Mr. and Mrs. Upsidedown were very quiet as they pointed to the one they would like. Clessidra sat down, smiling warmly, and began to ask after Mr. and Mrs. Upsidedown's well-being and talk about the loveliness of their village. By the time the tea had been drunk and cookies munched, the tea had been drunk. Let's have some more. Perfect temperature. And cookies munched. I must try some. Organic chocolate hazel chip and almond. Very nice. By the time the tea had been drunk and cookies munched, Mr. and Mrs. Upsidedown were feeling a little more comfortable with all the colour. As they later walked down the street towards their home, having waved goodbye to Clessidra. I must just finish my cookie. Mr. and Mrs. Upsidedown looked at each other quizzically. Arriving back home, somehow they both noticed the sparseness of their front garden. As they unlocked the front door and entered their home, suddenly the grey and white felt a little odd, a little awkward. Something within Mr. and Mrs. Upsidedown seemed to seek a quality which they felt to be missing. It dawned on them. Where was the colour? Instinctively, Mrs. Upsidedown went to the fridge, opened the door and pulled out the apples and oranges and placed them in a white bowl on the kitchen counter. Mr. Upsidedown found himself taking out a magazine from the briefcase, daring to lay its red cover openly on the coffee table. Something had got into them and it wasn't letting go. As it was Sunday the next morning and no one had to go to work, Mrs. Upsidedown felt herself rummaging around her wardrobe to see if there were anything different she could wear. Different from her black suit for the week and different from the grey and white tracksuit she would usually sport all weekend. Her eyes alighted on something pink, hiding in the back of her wardrobe. Reaching in, her hands met a silky pink skirt, which had been there back in the day before work when she was still a student. She pulled it out and tried it on. Amazingly, it still fitted. Look. but I think I better come back to this picture. I don't think we've had that part of the story yet. When he came down to breakfast that day, Mr. Upside-Down found his attention was disturbed by the flash of pink, which walked past him on his wife's body. Strangely, the colour seemed to make him think of things to do that day. Ordinarily, he checked his stocks and shares, mowed the lawn, polished his shoes, or polished the shoes, watched the news. But today, something was calling him to get into the garage and slide under the car. Now, before Mr. Upside-Down had been a suit wearer at the smart office, he had dreamt, on and off, of being a racing car mechanic. As his father had told him in no uncertain terms that this was not the way to live, Mr. Upside-Down had kept his passion quietly to himself. So quietly, in fact, that even he forgot it existed. Mrs. Upside-Down arrived home to find that her husband, her normally clean and tidy husband, was smeared with engine oil, humming a tune and grinning from ear to ear. As he looked up from his work on the car, Mr. Upside-Down was more than surprised to see his wife bearing a tray of hot tea and tremendous-looking cookies. This was starting to become a fun weekend. Whatever was getting into the two of them? The next week, Mr. and Mrs. Upside-Down found themselves doing more unusual activities. It was just a little at first, like waving out through the car window at Clessidra Turnabout as they drove past her in her garden on their way to the office on Monday morning. At work on Tuesday, somebody brought in fruit to share mid-morning, and on Friday evening, when they arrived home from work, they saw a fox in their garden. Neither of them had ever seen a wild animal up this close before, and they were rather frightened. The fox appeared to be sniffing around their rubbish bins where Mr. Upside-Down had taken out the TV dinner leftovers. Mrs. Upside-Down had scraped off their plates the previous night. The fox stayed in their garden a few days. Mr. and Mrs. Upside-Down felt their curiosity get the better of them, and they watched for the fox when he woke in the mornings. When returning from their day in the office, each evening they peeked around into the garden in case they caught a glimpse of the fine wild animal. On the fourth day, the fox had vanished. Oh, there he is, look. Oh, it looks like he's sending, are those hearts of love? Fox energy. Feeling a little low, Mrs. Upside-Down felt she would have a go at cooking something rather than just rely on their supermarket-bought meals. She attempted to bake a cake. Mr. Upside-Down felt that strange calling back to his garage and the greasy oilcloths of his engine maintenance. The weekend rolled around, the fox had not returned, but a strange itchiness of spirit hit both Mr. and Mrs. Upside-Down. They decided to casually stroll down the village street, passing Clessidra Turnabout's front garden. And there she was, gathering a bunch of spring bulbs to brighten her kitchen table, waving at them. Clessidra invited them in for a spot of cake and a cup of tea. Mr. and Mrs. Upside-Down felt their original shyness melt away from their hearts and accepted her offer graciously with a wave and a nod and 2 handshakes. As they were eating the cake, somewhere outside in the garden, a cockerel began to crow. It was Clessidra's fox, who minded her 3 egg-laying chickens. Then a very small wren hopped onto the open window ledge in the kitchen and sang a beautiful strain of birdsong. Well, maybe something like that. I think we should go back to that picture of Mr. and Mrs. Turnabout looking a little happier. They do, maybe. Ho! Something is happening, isn't it? A cockerel crows, a little wren is singing at the window. What is going to happen next? The grandfather clock in the hall chimed 4 o'clock in the afternoon with resonant tones, and a small purring cat began to wind its body around Mrs. Upside-Down's legs. Surrounded by all of this nature, Mrs. Upside-Down began to feel strangely elated. Her head felt lighter. It was buzzing. Then an odd thing happened. She felt herself beginning to lift, almost as if she was turning head over heels. Something's happening to Mrs. Upside Down. After thanking Clessidra profusely for the tea, Mr. and Mrs. Upside Down returned home. Each step they took felt different, giddy almost. By the time they arrived home, back in their black and white home, each of them felt like they needed to sit down again. As they sat, they looked around and wondered where all the colour was. Their cool grey house felt out of place since their visit to Clessidra Turnabouts for tea. Where were all the pictures, the framed photographs, the plants? Where were the soft furnishings, the cushions, the rugs? Why did the lighting feel so stark and so strange? And why did they both get this sudden urge to stand up and make some changes? Mr. Upside Down was the first to stand. He went to the fridge, looked inside, closed the door, and then abruptly took up his car keys and wallet and closed the front door behind him. Mrs. Upside Down behaved no less strangely. She went to a drawer, pulled out a large stack of magazines and spread them over the kitchen counter. 1 hour and 30 minutes later, she had torn out parts of pages from each one of them and created a collage, which she proceeded to stick on the fridge door. Then she took up her office laptop, opened her internet search, and bought coloured paint. Salmon pink for the kitchen and sunshiny ochre for the sitting room. As she walked into the garden, she felt her head getting dizzy again. Mr. Upside Down had just returned with an armful of slightly muddy carrots and 2 bulging shopping bags full of fresh produce. Putting these down on the kitchen counter, he looked out of the kitchen window in just enough time to see an extraordinary thing occurring. His wife, Mrs. Upside Down, was turning around. Where her head had been, her feet were now planted on the ground, only for an instant. But the change had made the most profound mark upon his senses. He glided out into the large, immaculate patio to join her when it struck him. Where were all the plants? He looked at Mrs. Upside Down, who from her new perspective had held this exact same thought in her mind. They suddenly realised the answer to their question as to why the beautiful wild fox had not stayed longer in their garden. The place was a desert of green grass and grey paving slabs, and nothing else. "We need flowers," said Mrs. Upside Down. "We need trees," spoke Mr. Upside Down, and they turned to each other and gasped. For at that moment, the extraordinary sensation of dizziness and turning had taken them over. Their bodies began to sink and their heads to rise. Their feet seemed to be magnetically pulled towards the earth, and their heads felt lighter than they had for years. Holding hands, they steadied themselves for a moment. They could see the distant hills beyond their garden fence. They could smell the scent of the jasmine blowing on the breeze from their neighbour's house. The garden looked cold and desolate. So they hurried inside while Mr. Upside Down was quick to notice the colourful display on the fridge. Mrs. Upside Down saw the spread of fresh fruit, fish and vegetables on the kitchen counter. The next day was the most different day in the lives of Mr. and Mrs. Upside Down. They went shopping and they bought many colourful things. Standing as they now did with their heads up so they could see so much more than before, they found themselves talking to dogs and small babies and children and even the juggler in the park. Mr. Upside Down bought screws and wrenches and engine oil and cloths. Mrs. Upside Down bought cushion covers and spring bulbs and flower seeds and a bright, colourful necklace of beads. It was incredible. It was extraordinary. It was delightful. I need a cup of tea after that. We can carry on and see what happens next. Monday morning came around again, and Mr. and Mrs. Upsidedown headed to the office, but their changes did not stop at home. They arrived 15 minutes late because Mrs. Upsidedown had bought a plant for her desk, and Mr. Upsidedown had had his eye caught by a poster of the most wonderful car engine in the world, which he had to buy to put up beside his desk. For the first time in years, the other workers at the office noticed Mr. and Mrs. Upsidedown and began a casual conversation. It was nothing at all about insurance or the latest sales figures. Instead, it was about Mr. and Mrs. Upsidedown's new hobbies, plants and engines. Even the boss stopped for a moment as she passed Mrs. Upsidedown's desk and admired her new plant. On the way home, Mr. Upsidedown made sure to drive past Clessidra Turnabout's house, and sure enough, she was standing in her front garden singing to the robin. You remember? She waved as she saw them. Mr. Upsidedown did an unusual thing. He rolled down his window, stopped the car in front of the gate and said, "Good evening." And then Mrs. Upsidedown did an even more unusual thing. She leant across Mr. Upsidedown and called out, "Would you like to come by on Saturday for lunch, Clessidra?" Even Mr. Upsidedown was surprised to hear this, but not in a bad way. He began to chuckle at his wife's good idea, and once they had agreed upon the time of 1 o'clock, he chuckled all the way home until he put his key in the lock. Look how happy and colourful they look. Oh my goodness. Arriving home, he suddenly had a sinking feeling when he thought of welcoming the colourful Clessidra Turnabout into his grey, black and white home. His head began to fall and his feet to rise up until his wife gave a little gasp of excitement as she pointed out to him that the paint she had ordered for their downstairs rooms had arrived. They would have colour and beauty to welcome Clessidra with by the end of the week if they both took a day off and painted their home. Mr. Upsidedown looked at Mrs. Upsidedown and smiled. He would have a chance to get messy and slip into his engine overalls, and the thought of doing that and not pushing paper at the office made him smile even more. His feet were once again firmly planted on the floor, and his head felt lightened and uplifted once more. With that, he excused himself and disappeared into the garage for an hour. Look at him. Slightly greasy, looking rather happy in his garage. As she gathered her new senses about her, seeing the world entirely differently from the new perspective, Mrs. Upsidedown realised she could finally look Clessidra right in the eyes, and she had seen a proper twinkle in them. She sat herself down on the sofa, took out a notepad and began to plan how she would paint the kitchen and sitting room, dig up a portion of the hard grey patio to plant flowers in, and ask her husband, Mr. Upsidedown, to plant a new tree to bring in some shade. As she wrote down her plans, she hummed a little, remembering the sweet sound of the wren's song she had heard through the Clessidra Turnabout's kitchen window. It brought her to an inspired idea. She would email their boss to ask her for 1 week's leave of absence. Contented that she'd be able to achieve all she had hoped for, Mrs. Upsidedown stood up, found her apron, and began to bake. This is probably a picture of her in the garden or just somewhere. It looks like she's happier at least. Oh, she began to bake. Well, it says until the next time, goodbye, because they're standing the right way up, Mrs. Upsidedown and Mr. Upsidedown, and there's Clessidra Turnabout. Her heart looks very happy, doesn't it? I wonder if they're standing in the new garden. I hope so. Do you? See you soon. Bye-bye.